All right, so lesson number 62, 1920s, the changing ways of life. So we're going to first focus on the economic changes. One of the economic changes where people were beginning to buy in mass, all right, mass production and mass consumption of consumer goods, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, radios, or stores like department stores are opening up. People could go in and buy something like you do at a Target or a Walmart or something along those lines. Automobiles, right? Ford's assembly line, automobiles were being made and accessible to everybody now. It wasn't just a luxury item. Everyone in America could buy themselves an automobile. Electric household appliances. People were buying on credit, okay, for the very first time. The radio, advertising on the radio and in magazines and newspapers. All this would help lead to what's considered a mass culture, okay? A set of ideas and values that develop from a common exposure to the same media. Is broadcast or otherwise distributed to individuals instead of arising from their day-to-day interactions with each other. Before a mass culture developed, there was regional cultures, right? People in the northeast, they had a different type of culture than people in the southwest, or people out in California might be different than people in Florida. But if you were to look today, because we still have this mass culture where we have different ways of being exposed to the same media through social media, through television, through Netflix, right? Through the movies. All these things are creating a mass culture, meaning this: the same jokes that we laugh about in class, if you're in California, you know who Terrio is, okay? If you're in California, you know it's Wednesday, my dudes. So all these things that we talk about as cultural or social ideas are something that everyone in the country also knows. So we have this American mass culture. That would not have been the case if you don't have these ways of exposing everyone to the same ideas. So in the 20s, that begins because of the radio. That begins because of advertising. So you see the developing of a mass culture for the first time. Everyone in the country is being exposed to the same pieces of media. All right? Moving on. One of the social changes we're going to talk about today is prohibition, okay? And it grew out of the temperance movement. Temperance was the idea that people should moderate their drinking. Prohibition is simply that. We're going to prohibit people from drinking. It represents a clash between the urban cities and the rural countrysides, between the modern and traditional values, the religious values. One of the things that is always going to go on when you have this kind of social, economic, political changes that are occurring, especially in the 1920s, you're going to have this kind of pulling at this in society, right? Those who want to remain in the tradition and those who want to move forward and progress. So one of those outbursts is prohibition. So the 18th Amendment prohibited the consumption, sale of alcohol. But what it did was it just caused a general disrespect for the law. People kept on drinking. When you prohibit something, people are going to go out and do it. You know, we're dealing right now with the lockdowns and the coronavirus, and there's already protests of people wanting to get out and do what they want to do. So when you start to prohibit things, people are going to react against those prohibitions. And eventually, which we'll talk about in the next couple weeks, the 21st Amendment is passed that repeals prohibition. So we have an amendment, the 18th, that prohibits the sale and consumption of alcohol, and the 21st Amendment that would repeal it. Just going to take a look at some documents quick. All right, so we do have some cartoons here. On this one, again, like we talk about all the time, you got to first concentrate on the title, right? An American Tragedy, and then start looking for some of the details in general. You have right here, Prohibition in the waters. And you have this arm hanging out, right? Pushing out of the water. Well, let's think a little bit about that. What does this arm represent? Obviously, it's the Statue of Liberty, right? So liberty is being drowned by prohibition. If you can't do what you want, your liberties are being taken away. Should the government decide whether or not you should drink or consume alcohol? That's up to discussion, right? All right, so over here, it's just like we're talking about today, right? Should the government tell you that you have to wear a mask? Should the government have the ability to say you can't go to a restaurant or to a bar? What is the reaction by the public when we do these things? All right. On the other side, this is more of a pro-prohibition cartoon, right? The modern devilfish here is what's being stabbed by the Prohibition Party. And why? Because people who drink, they defy the law, they traffic in girls, they gamble, they're thieves, they're corrupt. All right? These are all the things that the Prohibition Party is going to do. If we get prohibition, these are the things that will end as a result. All right? Good. All right, we have to talk about the Scopes, or trial, or what people called at the time the monkey trial. A little bit of the background of the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s. John Scopes, he challenged a law that banned the teaching of evolution. Scopes was a biology teacher in the state of Tennessee. They had a law that said you were not allowed to teach about evolution, and John Scopes challenged that law. Scopes was convicted in the trial and paid a small fine because he did violate Tennessee state law. This again highlights the conflict between science and religion, modern and tradition. The people in Tennessee wanted their teachers to teach about creationism. They wanted to continue their, fundamentalist religious beliefs in the classroom, and there were modernists who said, no, we have to teach kids about evolution as well. So again, this conflict between the modern and the tradition. A couple cartoons. All right. First one here. You have Let There Be Darkness, right? We're going to concentrate on the title. And when we start looking at some of the details, correct? All right, so we got knowledge here. We got a hand with a little, looks like a hat, but that's actually a candle snuffer. It's going to snuff out the flame and the flame of knowledge. And here is Tennessee here. All right. So this is obviously in favor of Scopes on teaching evolution, as opposed to allowing for just the teaching of creationism. If we don't support Scopes, as Tennessee's trying to do, right? They're trying to make sure Scopes doesn't teach about evolution. We're snuffing out knowledge, and there'll be darkness. All right, and over here, we have on the Book of Knowledge, okay? On the Book of Knowledge, we have a man, and he's got a sign that says, Fundamentalists Only, Wanted as Teachers, a closed book in Tennessee. All right, the Book of Knowledge is closed because we only want fundamentalist religious people to teaching our students. All right, we have two more cartoons here. On the left-hand side, afraid of his own shadow. The fundamentalist afraid that he did not obviously come from monkeys, according to the Bible, but this cartoon is saying, well, maybe we did. So this was a really hotly, debated topic. This was all in the news, big thing at the time, and no wonder the monkeys are worried. I say, Genevieve, in his evolution case, are they trying to class men with monkeys or monkeys with men? And it shows all the different negative events or things that go on in human society. All right. Being critical of human beings in general. All right, good. Women, another conflict in the 1920s. The 19th Amendment had given women the right to vote, and it had assumed that women had more equality. There were more opportunities for college in the 1920s, more opportunities for women to work outside the home, more independence. And as a result, this led to changes in morals and behavior. The flappers, which these young women were called, clashed with their traditional cultural values. So again, we have prohibition, we have the Scopes trial, we have women, all this kind of clash between the traditionalists and the modernists. And these flappers were heavily criticized, all right, that they were pushing the boundaries of what was correct moral behavior. Immigration. All right, so we've done a little bit of this in class already, so we're just going to quickly go through a little bit of review. But if you remember, we talked about this idea that there were waves of immigration, and the immigration wave we're going to talk about today is new immigration. And we've discussed this already. We did this right before, I guess it was right before the midterm or right after the midterm. We discussed this idea of new immigration. All new immigration means a different wave of people from a different part of the country, a different part of the world, right? They're going to come from Southern and Eastern Europe. They're going to be darker hair, darker skin. They're going to be very, very poor. They're going to have crazy languages that we don't understand. They're going to be Catholics. They're very different from all the previous groups of immigrants into the country. And this graph kind of shows what we're talking about here. So, all right, so this is the areas we're discussing here, right? So, Central and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So if you look at the first group, 1861 to 1880, most immigrants who came into the country were coming from Northern and Western Europe. They were fair-skinned, fair hair. They were Protestants. They had a little bit of a familiarity with English. They usually were not very, very poor. They had money in most cases, all right, except for those who came from Ireland. So between 1861 and 1880, 69% of the people who came here as immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe. And as you can see, it's rapidly declining. In the 20 years that we're talking about now, between 1901 and 1920, it's really declined, right? These are the people that are coming from North and Western Europe. But you can see the extent that was Central Europeans and Southern Europeans, all right, and the countries are listed up here, were starting to pour into the country. And they were very different from the immigrants that had come beforehand, all right? And there was a lot of fear that they could not assimilate easily. Right? They were not going to become more like us. It was impossible for them because they were so different. This led to the fear of foreigners and led calls for restrictions and led actually to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. We oftentimes, concentrate on the Klan as being a anti-black group, but it was also an anti-immigrant group, especially in the 1920s. In the 1920s, the Klan was at its height because of so much immigration. So here again, this image of Lady Liberty, and it must be extinguished if you allow for the KKK to be in charge. All right. Also, at this time, we have what's known as the Red Scare. And it was a fear that communists were going to take over the United States. Thousands of people who were thought to be communists were arrested. Some of them were actually deported, sent out of the country. So let's just take a look at some of these cartoons. All right. So we have the first one on the left-hand side, title, put them out and keep them out. And we look at this, and we look at this in total now, right? Get a whole general feel for it. What do we got going on here? Well, obviously we got the American flag, and we got somebody crawling out from underneath it. All right, on his hat it says Reds, which is communists, Bolshevism, communism, anarchy, right? And he's trying to, he's trying to sneak in to the country. We got to put them out and keep them out. All right, and on this side, we have a reference to the poem that we talked about in class, right? On the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, come unto me, ye oppressed. And here's the Statue of Liberty, another representation of liberty in these documents. And you have this European anarchist walking in with his knife and his bomb. And we got to make sure that we don't let these people into the country. Another conflict of this era was the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. The Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants. They were accused and put on trial for murder in a robbery. And they were executed for that crime. They were found guilty of that crime. And there was very little evidence that it was them. People believe that they were executed more for their views than for any crime they may have committed and their background. All right, so now we have this conflict between the modernism and traditionalists and immigrants, and this kind of all kind of swirling together. And now you have these two men who were accused of a crime they probably didn't commit, but they were radicals, they were Italians, they were unlike everyone else, and their lives were taken, all right, as a result of this trial. So what do we do about immigrants? Well, in the 1920s, we begin to think about restrictions, right? We begin to think about how can we restrict the amount of immigrants that are coming into the country. So the government passes two laws in the 1920s that set quotas, and a quota is a limited amount of immigrants allowed based on where you're from. And I'll explain how that worked in a second. So you're going to take the total number of immigrants, and you're going to say we're going to allow this many immigrants into the country, and we're going to allow a certain amount from each country to come in. All right, that's the goal. So we're going to limit and restrict immigration to a certain amount, which is a quota, and then within that certain amount, each country is going to be represented. And I have a chart that I'll show you in a second with respect to that. So here's an example we're talking about. All these Europeans want to come into the country, but we're going to put a limit on the amount that can come in. And we're going to decide who can come in. So looking at this chart right here, you can see what we're talking about with respect to quotas. All right, so if our total immigrant quota is going to be 164,000 people, we're going to divide that up based on where you're from. So if you take a look at this, we don't mind if you come from Germany. That has a huge number. We don't mind if you come from Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's a big number. Even Ireland at this time, big number. But if you look at countries that are not from Northwest Europe or Scandinavia or these Northern and Western European countries, and you start looking at where we're going to allow people to come from with respect to Eastern and Southern Europeans, look, Italy, only 3,000. Great Britain, 34,000. Italy, a little over 3,000. Right, or a little under 4,000 actually. So these are all the Eastern European countries, and you can see the numbers are quite low compared to the North and Western Europeans, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to limit the amount of immigrants that are coming from these Southern and Eastern European countries because they're so much different than we are. All right, so let's just take a look at this chart real quick, and then we're going to move on. So if you take a look at this total immigrants by decade, you can see starting in the 1820s and so on. We're concentrating on this area over here. All right. And then 1900 to 1910s, you see this huge spike. 8.2 million immigrants are coming into the country. And then over time, you're seeing this decline. Well, this decline here in the 1910s, that's due to the war in Europe. And then you see this coming, kind of going down here in the 1920s. And what's happening is those restrictions that we just talked about are working now, right? We're having less and less immigrants come in. And then eventually you're going to have the Great Depression. You're going to have the Great Depression in World War I and World War II, and that's going to have a real bottoming out of the immigration chart. But this is showing how immigration restrictions are working, right? We're getting less and less immigrants in as we set quotas. Okay? All right. Let's move on to the left-hand side. So, today's left-hand side, the 1920s saw a conflict between those who wanted to progress into a modern age and those who wanted to slow down that change. So you're going to choose one of the following. Do you think it was justified or necessary response to a changing world? So take one of the four ideas, the Scopes trial or events, prohibition, the criticism of the flappers, or immigration quotas, and decide whether or not you think it was justified or necessary, either one. Make a claim, right? You might say the Scopes monkey trial was necessary in response to a changing world. And then give your reasoning and your evidence. Use the documents, use the stuff that we talked about in the lecture, whatever it is to support your reasoning and your claim. All right? Good luck.